Well, very welcome to everybody. Warm welcome to everybody joining us for this special talk, which is part of our Botanic Garden series. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Alan Matchett, who's from the Botanic Gardens, Dunedin Botanic Garden in New Zealand, and he's going to talk to us about New Zealand's first botanic garden and all of those that followed. So thank you very much for joining us. Very, very warm welcome from the Commonwealth Heritage Forum. Over to you, Alan. Thank you.
Oh, hi there, everyone. Thanks for having me along. Yeah, I'm going to be reading from notes, so don't be too prepared to look away. There's quite a few dates and whatnot. It's quite a few slides here to look through as well. And for a start, I'm actually going to do this in reverse and actually talk about the gardens that followed, and then Dunedin, and just look at some of the elements, particularly around some of the features at the Dunedin Botanic Garden. But first up, there's a old map, as you can see, 1867. This is of Auckland, and shows where New Zealand's first public park was established, and that's in this green area here. And that was established by Governor Captain William Hobson, who took control of New Zealand in the days, and he set aside 100 acres for a guest house, a park, and also employed a government gardener. And at the same year, they established a nursery, and that nursery produced thousands of plants which were given away to new settlers that arrived in New Zealand. Yeah, it finally ended up in a 196 hectare site and was decreed a government domain. It's now called Auckland Domain for those who may also be familiar with that area. This is Napier Botanic Garden or Botanical Garden. You'll notice as we go through the difference in names. We've got Botanic Gardens, Botanical Gardens, and Botanic Garden. So Napier, 18 hectares was set aside for the Botanical Garden in 1854, but never really developed until some time later. Rather just appeared as an allocation of space on an early map. However, by 1874, when Napier was declared a borough, the garden was already under development by an earlier provincial government who was taking control of the early development. This is Timaru Botanic Gardens, and it was established in 1864 with 25 hectares of land. Typically of the time, very little happened in those early days. But gradually progress was made, and today Timaru Botanic Gardens is a lovely garden, and it features a conservatory, notable collections of roses and native plants, amongst others. There's also significant for Timaru with Botanic Garden is that in 1948, after a seed collecting trip in China, where seed of Metasequoia glyptostroboides, or the dawn redwood, previously thought extinct, was collected, seed sent to Timaru, and they germinated the seed and distributed plants from those early germinations right around New Zealand. It's an early shot of Gisborne, the Botanic Garden there. It was established in 1874 on a very small site of about 2.5 hectares, and another number of hectares was added, bringing the total up to just over 5 sometime after. Typically of New Zealand gardens in the day, it was developed and noted as a botanic garden, and some of those were developed along the lines of, I guess, where a botanic garden should be looking at, with plant collections, etc. But of course, with funding issues of various councils who run the gardens, at some stage, particularly in the 60s, input to the garden was reduced, if you like. It was managed more like a park. But in the 70s, the Friends of the Gardens got involved, and they started to influence how the garden was managed. and it became more like a small botanic garden. Oh. In 1876, the National Parliament passed the Taranaki Botanic Garden Act, where 3 exotic trees and a native pururi, a New Zealand native tree, were planted during a public ceremony that recognised the establishment of the Taranaki Botanic Garden. In 1908, the reserve was renamed Pukekura Park, and later on another neighbouring property was added, and that was Brooklands, and that included a small zoo. So today this area here, or this garden, is called Pukekura Park, Brooklands. This is a large pond area, is rather obvious, but this is on the west coast of the North Island of New Zealand. This photo just depicts the official opening of, it's had a number of days, but the Otari Open Air Museum, as it was called in the day. This is a 5-hectare site, and it was dedicated for growing New Zealand native plants. It's also part of a large area called Wilton's Bush, which is over 100 hectares, and within that bush there are some significant plant or trees of natural origin, including 800-year-old rimu trees. Was established the plant collections were established in 1926 by the then eminent botanist Dr. Leonard Cockayne, and it's still the only garden in New Zealand solely whose sole purpose is for growing and displaying New Zealand native plants. This is an early photograph showing the pond at Hamilton Botanic Garden, which is again in the this is in the central North Island. Some of you may be familiar. Development of the garden began in the early 1960s, so it isn't that old in terms of New Zealand gardens. And at that stage, this area was part of, well, finishing, I guess, as a refuse area for the city's rubbish, but obviously has been developed considerably since then. Today, the Hamilton Garden, if I can say that, can say and quote something, it's been described as sort of not the traditional botanic garden with plant collections. Rather, its purpose, and I quote, is to promote the appreciation and understanding of gardens, their history, context and meaning. And for those who are planning a trip to New Zealand, this garden is certainly worth visiting. It is quite spectacular in the way it has been set up. And as the description describes, quite different from any other botanic gardens. Again, a very early photograph showing, I guess this is the opening day. This is the 1960s. This garden is called the Basin Botanic Garden, and is at Whanganui on the west coast of the lower North Island. It's a late addition to the Botanic Garden network, and this was a gift. In 1966, Stanley and Blanche Basin offered their 25-hectare property and homestead garden to the local city council. And typical of that period, as mentioned before, the 1960s was difficult for some authorities to fund gardens. There's quite a lot of vigorous debate about accepting the gift, knowing of the downstream effects of costs to manage it. However, they did decide to take it on, and it has been developed along those lines, obviously within the resources of the local authority. Stanley Basin, who gifted the garden, had a very focused idea of what he and how he saw the garden developed. And again, if I can just quote something that he mentioned at the time, it is to be a botanic garden, not a park, largely for scientific purposes, catering for both utility and aesthetic interests, a place for study, not just for pretty flowers. And here's the newest garden. This is Auckland. This is the opening ceremony in 1982. and it's the New Zealand Governor General addressing the crowd. As I say, it's late in the piece, but discussions for its development, for its establishment, if you like, started way back in the 1920s. Little progress was made. However, in the 1960s, like-minded people got together and started searching for a site where they could develop a botanic garden, and they found 84 hectares in Manukau area, and the rest is history. The first site, if I say, was turned over in 1970, and as I say, in 1982, 9 years later, the garden was opened. Wellington Botanic Garden. Again, it's in the capital city, and some may be familiar. It is in the central area, and it is very easily accessible for people for taking time out. In 1855, the superintendent of the province, sorry, just better go back one. The directors of the New Zealand Company, still in the UK at the time, advised their Surveyor General, Lieutenant Mine Smith, that in his survey of the new community or settlement, he was to make adequate provision for reserves, including cemeteries, a marketplace, a wharf, and a botanic garden. So in 1844, 12 hectares of land near Karori Road, and this is the Karori Road that runs up here, the suburb of modern Wellington, and it was set aside for the botanic garden. But it wasn't until 1869 that any development work started. This is a very early shot of the nursery area in Christchurch Botanic Garden. Quite interesting entrance gates there for lattice work, and it's actually a feature, and it did appear in an earlier photograph of many early gardens. The timbers used likely to be a native tree, Kānuka or Manuka, which often grew with straight stems, very durable, and obviously ideal for this type of structure as well. In 1855, the superintendent of the province and founder of Christchurch, John Godley, he set aside an area of 500 acres for Hagley Park. And again, for those who have been there, Hagley Park is an extensive area, incorporating a huge area of reserve land, which caters for all sorts of sport and recreation activities. The Botanic Garden is sort of situated on the southern end of this area. The Albert Edward Oak was planted in July 1863, and that was the official acceptance date of the founding of the Botanic Garden. However, again, as mentioned, not a lot happened in those early days. They actually started off as two separate entities, the garden and the nursery, and these were joined together officially later and become the Christchurch Botanic Gardens. Moving on to territory more familiar to myself. This photograph shows, it's not the best one, a shot of the corner of Dunedin Botanic Garden. I'm going to show you the circular area here. In the centre of there is an oak tree, and like Christchurch, that plus a second oak were planted to commemorate the marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales back in 1863. Dunedin predates Christchurch as the oldest garden by 10 days. A little bit of competition there in the past, but June 30th, 1863 was the official founding day of Dunedin Botanic Garden. The area here is interesting. What we can't see here is a little stream that runs past called Water of the Leaf. Obviously reminiscent to the settlers of Water of the Leaf back in Edinburgh. However, early in those days was described as the little stream that could not be improved upon. Well, the effects of that stream were quite catastrophic for the garden, and in 1868 rather, there was a large flood, which actually washed about an acre of that land away, and also took away the one of the oak trees. So there's only one of the oaks left. At that time, the city fathers thought perhaps it best to move the garden out of harm's way. In this early map, you can see here in the centre left is the site where that photograph was taken of the Botanic Gardens, or Botanical Gardens as they called it in those days. The official name is the Dunedin Botanic Garden. This site now is actually where the University of Otago is situated. However, if you look up to the right, you'll see an area called the Acclimatisation Society grounds. And in 1869, the Botanic Garden, as such, was moved onto that site. And along with it, the remaining oak was also transplanted. This is a very early photograph, the 1870s, of the garden. As mentioned, the Acclimatisation Society were already on the site, so some early groundwork had already been done. But this shot shows the nursery area in the centre here, very well formed at that stage. And the next photograph is just to the right. We saw the nursery over this side here. This is the rest of the garden in front of you. This is in the northern area of Dunedin, Northeast Valley, and the large hill in the background there is Flagstaff. A later shot in the 1890s, and you can see how much the garden has developed, or certainly the trees. It's one thing about gardens, they're a dynamic environment, and of course, with plants living as such, things certainly change. I'm just going to look at some of the more defined features of the garden. And in the centre of this photograph, you can see one here, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we go through. In this photograph, it's titled as the Summer House, but when it was constructed in the 1870s, 1873 in fact, it was actually built by Maori prisoners of war, which were held in Dunedin at that time. In the 1870s, there was certainly disputes in the North Island with different Maori tribes and defending their land. They felt that some of the land was taken from them unjustly, and quite rightly, as history tells us, through settlement of disputes through the Waitangi Tribunal, some of that land was returned. However, at the day, they were regarded as breaking the law, and some of those were transferred to Dunedin. And the South Island, also at that time, was much more settled in terms of its relationship with the indigenous populations. So in those early days, this was called the Maori house, and as you can see, it's got a thatched roof, and again, the lattice work around the edges, which I would suggest would be what I mentioned before, some of the kānuka and manuka, which is very durable, very straight in how it grew as well, so very versatile. And some early plantings around the base. So another shot in a later period, probably in the 1940s. It's interesting to note that, as you saw in the earlier slide, it was called the Summer House, but it had a number of names somehow. It was also called the Crusoe House, which I guess some thought may have looked a bit like Robinson Crusoe's abode. The Summer House is mentioned, but also it's called the Rustic Shelter. This, as I say, was built in the early 1870s. It was demolished quite late in the piece in 1955 after falling in disrepair. Bandstands. These are all too familiar in public parks, and Dunedin was nonetheless regarded as a popular place for these structures. This is not the first bandstand that was erected at the Botanic Garden. That was first established in 1887. This was moved on site in 1901. It's not actually a bandstand as such, nor designed nor built as one. It was built as a pavilion. It was erected in the Octagon area, the central area of Dunedin. And it was used during the visit of the Duke and Duchess of York and Cornwall at the time in 1901. And because the existing one at the Botanic Garden had fallen into disrepair, the cheap option at the time was to disestablish this here in the Octagon and shift it in the Botanic Garden. And hence you have a four-sided or open-sided shelter, if you like. It was called the Band Pavilion rather than the Band Rotunda. There's just a second shot, just showing just some a little bit different angles, slightly different aspects of the structure as well, particularly the stairwell going up. This shot, and again with its inset, is looking outwards from where the band pavilion was established, looking across the lawn to the rock garden. Below the rock garden, where my cursor is pointing now, is a stream called Lindsay Creek. And like the water of Leith, has had a significant influence on the development of the Botanic Garden. On the hillside, you can see people sitting up there, and of course that was a great viewing site for those wishing to take in the music coming from the pavilion at the time. The inset obviously looks much later, of course. That's that is in the early early 2000s. And that shows a series of terraces that have been cut into that same bank, and seats which were placed there in the 1950s. The seats still remain, but that actual area itself behind the seats looks quite different now. It's been planted up to sort of take the formality of those hard lines across that site away. The rock garden still remains, and that was a development of the then director David Tannock in 1908. Here are plans of the replacement band rotunda, I should say bandstand. It wasn't called a band rotunda, although it is still commonly called that today. And this was established on site in 1914, so the pavilion didn't last too long at all. It was designed by the Dunedin City or City Council's building surveyor, Mr. G.W. Goff. And it was described by Mr. Goff as taking the form of a stage, 3 sides closed with a proscenium front. This is the prevailing style in Britain and the continent, he went on to say. And he also said, I've endeavoured to treat the building in Oriental design. Let's move on from here. The proscenium is flanked on each end with a domed tower, roof covered in Marseille tiles, sidewalls and ceiling being well shaped to allow the volume of sound free egress. This is a 1940s photograph across to the bandstand from the area where we were looking at before on those terraces. Again, interesting to see the bridge. Again, that lattice work, some of the timbers, and this is Lindsay Creek, which I mentioned before. This is a photograph of the latest restoration, if you like, of the bandstand. Some of the features, particularly the paintwork, have altered slightly. This gives you a better idea of the design and construction of the facility. Of note too, if I just go back to the previous one, if you look along the front, you'll see that the railing is entire. You could only access the stand from the back. On the sides, on each side of the bandstand, there were 2 small rooms, and they housed the seating, etc., used by the bands for their performances. However, because it's so difficult to access, as we see from this next photograph, that railing was modified to insert a series of steps leading from the grass in front onto the stage itself. And there you can see one of the doorways into the wee rooms. I should say the bandstand, yeah, it's timber construction. Been there since 1914 and has undergone a number of renovations. The last significant one was in 1988. Was quite a bit of work done in terms of replacing rotten timbers, the dry rot and those affected by the borer insects. This is the winter garden, probably the most significant development that occurred at the Botanic Garden. It was first proposed in 1906, and it was based on a design submitted by Mackenzie and Moncure of Edinburgh. But later the design was actually modified by local architects Mason and Wales. The cost of the project was £3,700 in the day, which is quite a considerable amount of money, and that was contributed by a local businessman, Mr. Robert Glendenning. And when it was finally opened in 1908, the Winter Garden was supposedly the first such structure in Australasia, which was quite a considerable feat when you think about it. So I just perhaps should go back to that previous one, go the right direction. Things have changed over the years during just maintenance periods for the garden itself. We've got the large central house, which I should have pointed out. We have an entranceway here, the wee foyer. But of interest is just some of the detail, the rounded arches. Also in the next one, you'd see the arches better on the entranceway, but also the around the windows themselves, they were also curved. Whether the glass was curved as well, it's hard to say. This is the rear, looking from slightly angled, of course, at the rear of the building. And as you can see, there's no entrance on this other side here, just an end wall, and the entrance way was on this side. This is actually classified as a historic, the central area as a historic building as well. It morphed into other things as time went on. The central structure had other glass houses added to it. In 1912, an orchid house was added to the back of this area here. And that was donated also, and that was constructed to house a collection of 1,500 orchids that were also donated to the Botanic Garden. In 1918, two more buildings were added to house more orchids and a fernery. And at that stage, there were 7 different sections within that complex. Where are we? This is the chimney boiler house, which heated the facility with hot water, which was circulated around the different areas. A later period, probably in the 1940s, this shot here. Again, looking quite different from what we saw before. You can just make out the chimney in that central area there of the boiler house. However, we've got a whole new structure that's been built across here. And that is the new fernery. In 1925-26, Dunedin hosted a big exhibition called the South Seas Exhibition. And the city went all out to welcome guests who visited that, and it was a huge site which has developed with a whole lot of attractions for visiting tourists, etc. This was part of that that display at the exhibition, and when the exhibition was finished in 1926, it was disassembled and reassembled here at the Botanic Garden. Other areas of note too is actually in the central house, which you can see here. Is the vent opening from the top outwards. That no longer exists in that form in this day, and also roof vents of this house here. This is what we call the duck pond area in front. Very much a different scene today. Again, a little bit later, in the early 1950s. Again, there's been an addition here of the fernery. I have no idea what that is. It's a pretty rough looking building, but also of note, you actually sort of see the deterioration in the fernery roof as well. It was actually closed in the early 1950s to the public because of issues with falling glass from the roof. This is much later in the 1960s, and the site has changed quite a bit, as you can see. Winter garden we can make out, but also we have a whole new structure in the centre there, and that is the replacement fernery. That was built in 1962 and housed a whole range of native ferns. Also significantly at the time, there were other changes here as well. If we just still talk about the glass houses, my pointer gone. In this area here, this is what we call the east wing of the glass house complex. And that has also changed, as you can just sort of make out. Has ended up with a flat roof which butts up against the end of the fernery. And this was then converted to a cactus house. The arch at the end of the fernery, you can see the line of windows there. That was a raised platform which you could gain access by stairs to look down the fernery from a high level position. The buildings on the left with a large sun umbrella, and we'll see more of that later on. This is the tea kiosk. This area we're looking at here is what we affectionately call the lower gardens. It's, as you can see from the early photographs, it's quite flat. The tea kiosk was built in 1966, and as you can see, there's a connecting feature between the tea kiosk and the fernery across this terrace here as well. Another feature here that stands out is the creek, which I mentioned earlier. This is Lindsay Creek. The band stand is to the right of this feature of this pond here as well. So we're sort of looking at the same site. The creek, as I mentioned before, did play a significant role and still does in the Botanic Garden. It did have more of a natural water course as it flowed through the garden. However, because of flooding and certainly the early flooding of the waters of the Leith, which this flows into, the city fathers thought it was too risky to leave it as it is, so they deepened it and also lined the edges with rock as well, which you can't actually see. It's quite a distinctive feature, which probably runs about 300 metres through the garden from left to right, from right to left. This is one of the very few shots of the inside of the fernery. And as you can see, it's been constructed of...
Alan, can you unmute?
Trying.
There we go. You're back.
Right, okay. Sorry about that. Now, what happened to my... Oh, are we all go again?
Yes. Yep.
Yep.
That's well
sorry
done.
about that.
Thank you. We'll let you carry on. Thank you.
Right. As I mentioned, this is one of the rare photographs of the inside of the fernery, showing the distinctive laminated beams which form the arch. During the renovation of the Winter Garden complex in 1990, the fernery was actually removed. and we'll see in a later shot the effects of that. And during that renovation, it was a complete rebuild of the Winter Garden complex as it was first built. Obviously didn't have the intricate design in terms of the windows, the shapes and the arches that the earlier building did. But the fernery was removed. The cactus house, which I mentioned before, which I'll show before with that flat roof. Here ended up with a full apex as it was before. But we'll see glimpses of the renovation later. Just an early shot, just moving on slightly, of the entranceway to the garden, and with an inset. The inset shows an early set of gates which were manufactured locally, and they were erected in 1907 at the northern entrance to the garden. However, for some reason, they thought they needed something else, and were replaced by these stone pillars, and the gates and the wings cast iron, very, very heavy gates, and they still exist there today. This little building here was another hand-me-down from the South Seas exhibition, and that was just used as a shelter for, obviously, people passing by, and there's a telephone box there, as we can see, so this is quite late in the piece as well, in the 1950s. This is a quite significant feature of the garden. This is the maize. This was planted out in 1910 and opened in 1918. It covers about 3,600 square yards, or just over 3,000 square metres, and there are 1,175 holly plants, which form the structure, if you like, of the maze. This is in the lower garden, and here on the upper left, you can just see a glimpse of the summer house, or rustic house, which we saw earlier. Unfortunately, I was talking about the Lindsay Creek before, meandering through the garden, and we can just sort of see the edge of it there. During the period of concern around flooding in the just after the opening of this, 1923, the maize was actually removed, and the Lindsay Creek straightening took place. A new maize was replanted in the upper garden, and yeah, that never lasted that long either, and that was eventually removed as well. Particularly high maintenance, this type of feature. This is an area, the wider area is the Shakespeare Garden around the edges of this, and this knot garden we see is a later development. The Shakespeare Garden was established in 1914, but the knot garden wasn't added until 1933. And it was based on a design of a knot garden, supposedly in Shakespeare's garden at his house in Stratford-on-Avon. However true that is, I'm not quite sure. It'd be hard to find specific detail about the knot garden in his of Shakespeare's. The sundial again was something, another hand-me-down, was a term I used before from the South Seas exhibition, and that is still on site, and pretty much the structure of that garden as you see it now, other than the level of maturity, of course, it still exists as it is. This is the Wolf Harris Fountain, situated in the lower garden and almost on the site of where that maize was situated. On the left, the insert there shows the fountain when it was first gifted to the city in 1890. It was gifted by Wolf Harris, who was a successful business, Harris, Bing and Sargood at the time. It's not sure whether it's a one-off or not. There have been suggestions that there are others around the world, Belgium, but that's not confirmed at all. Rather ornate, as you can see from the features on the right-hand side. It's the heron, the top photograph, which sits on top, and some of the cherubs and crocodiles. Around the centre dish here is some gargoyles, and we have fish, ornate fish around this section. It's been restored several times over the years and runs on recirculated water, which is pumped through, and everything still works. But again, features like this are quite high maintenance as well. As the photo indicates, the main photograph, there's no water in it this time. And this is also a listed feature with Heritage New Zealand as well. This is the Upper Garden Tea Kiosk. It was built in 1925, a princely sum of £1,415 and 11 shillings. Once it was constructed, a putting green and a croquet lawn were established on the sides over here, on either side, and over on this other side as well. Unfortunately, it wasn't a successful venture for those who operated the facility there. Struggled over many, many years and had different uses as well. It was actually demolished in 1982, not long after I started actually. It was rented out at that time for functions, wedding functions, etc. But unfortunately, it was in the Upper Garden, and the support for visitors to go to the Upper Garden has never been that great. There's no public service there in terms of buses, so it was always a difficult site to be able to attract and make a successful business of. There's now a part of the native plant section which has been developed on that site. Back to the Lower Garden. This is a shot in the late 1940s of the Iris Garden. This feature was donated by the Dunedin Horticultural Society, and as you can see here, it is based on a series of levels going down to a centre piece here, which was a small pond. And again, the water was recirculated as this pond area is actually lower than the outside area of this pathway these people are walking on out here. Again, some interesting lattice work in terms of the fencing around another small pond. And it's had a number of uses over the years as well. In the late 1950s and 1970s, it was used for bedding displays, as you can see here. This also shows a little bit more of the detail of how the circular rings were formed. And around the edge, it was enclosed by a Lanissera hedge. And a much later photograph, in the 1980s, the garden was given a sole purpose as a herb garden, and this was a collaboration with the local herb society, and they provided a huge amount of input in terms of volunteers to establish the garden here, and they have helped pretty much on a monthly basis right through to 2019, and unfortunately the society disbanded. Slight modification here. There's a fountain in the centre here. This is an autumn shot, so normally the fountain is shut down because of the issue with autumn leaves collecting and blocking the pipework. Sometimes this whole lower area will flood. The stonework is quite unique. It's used around the garden in a number of different areas. There's flagstones, which Horswell stone is the type of stone, and it comes from the Horswell quarry in Christchurch. One of the unfortunate features of it, though, of course, once it's wet, it gets quite slippery, so it's likely to be replaced at some stage. Just going back to a feature we saw early on, the tea kiosk. and built in 1966, depicting the obvious in terms of the shape of the sun umbrella. And it's elevated, as you can see, and we saw this earlier walkway towards the leading towards the fernery of the day as well. On the terrace here, you can also see some umbrellas are actually atop a table, a set of table and chairs, which you can see on the lower left of the centre. This is not long after the 1990 renovation, and there's a number of features here to just mention. The tea kiosk, of course, are looking quite different. The fernery, which was down here, is gone, obviously, and the grass has been restored. Part of the canopy leading towards the fernery is retained, of course. The terrace area has been completely upgraded. Tables no longer exist, and you can see the east wing, as we saw before, is where it had a flat roof adjoining the fernery. It's now been restored back to what it was originally. The other feature here, perhaps not so obvious now since we've moved on from the early photographs, is the panes of glass and the timbers. In the original build, the panes were much narrower, so there's a lot more timber forming the structure as well. So these were reduced as time went on and renovations and repairs were made. The inset goes back to that early photograph where the fernery was still there, showing the sun umbrellas and table combination, and also some of the winter garden itself. And also here you can see where some panels of glass were actually replaced by the square glass bricks, if you like, an added feature that later developments seem to think that was needed. There are a number of brass works around the garden. This is Peter Pan, and Peter was erected here in 1963. The bronze work itself was commissioned by Mr. Richmond, a local Dunedin resident, who commissioned English sculptor Cecil Thomas to produce this bronze work. Later in 1966, a second one was added, Wendy, which completed the set. And it also, these both originals from Cecil Thomas, and later still in 2000, we were also gifted a bronze terrier, if you like, Chippy Mark IV, and it was also sculpted by Thomas. So moving slightly forward, the structure here is the pergola garden. It was built on the site in 1979. And the original purpose of the garden was to demonstrate and to be used for growing climbing plants. A feature, I guess, noticed by the pergolas. It's split over a number of levels across the site from the right to the left, a series of steps. This central area here used to be a pond. It was quite a deep pond as well, which was concerns around particularly unaccompanied children falling in. The idea of the pond, particularly its depth, was to provide a reflection of the environment around there. It did work to a degree, but also other issues with the water, of course. We ended up with algae growing, with frogs and the tadpoles, etc., etc. So it never really achieved its purpose. It was difficult to maintain, and it was also in an isolated part of the garden at the time. Today, some of you may recognise the plants, some of the plants here, but this has been converted, if you like, now used as part of our South or Southern African collection. Some of the original climbers have been retained to use the features that were provided at the time. This is a later artwork. This is called Uribus, or Worm, with two O's in it. This is a sculpture by Julia Morrison, and it was commissioned by the City Council in commemoration of the 150th anniversary in 2013. Slightly changed from its initial installation. It's a stainless steel tube, as you can see, and the insert there shows you the lattice work, which has been cut by laser. This feature is entirely tactile. It can be, if you're strong enough, picked up, or parts of it being picked up and shifted, if you like. These stands were much higher at one stage, but had to be reduced because of the weight and, it'd be fair to say, the use and abuse that the worm has had to put up with over the years. The technology behind this actually is no longer here in New Zealand. As I say, it was cut by laser, was a special import. It's actually based in a company in Napier, which we talked about before, but because of the work for that particular laser wasn't forthcoming, it was actually sold overseas. But how it holds itself together, I don't know, but quite interesting nonetheless. However, it has suffered a lot of damage, and if you look along the structure here, you can sort of see where people have, particularly children, walking across it, have damaged it over the years as well. And occasionally there's a band around it which covers areas that have, or joins areas that have been damaged. So just how long this lasts, I'm not quite sure, but the artist certainly intended it to be used by people. It wasn't just to be a static and stagnant feature, if you like. The tea kiosk is just to the right of this and looks down on the worm. But it's amazing how many people use it. Adults walking their children around it, holding their hand, and even adults running around it as well. And being so close to the University of Otago, it gets a little bit of abuse from the odd student coming through on a late night as well. Just nearing the finish, I just wind up with a few more modern areas of the garden, some of the structures. In the left here is the shelter, which was in the Lister Garden. Professor Clive Lister, who was on sabbatical at the University of Otago. He visited the garden on a frequent basis, and obviously at times he was troubled by the intentions of his gift to the garden later on. He sought solace here, and impressed him so much that he donated a significant amount on his death and his will to the Botanic Garden to develop a garden where people could just chill out, sit down and relax as he did. That was developed in 1998. The two photographs on the diagonal across here is part of the Mediterranean Garden. As you can see, a very formal plaza has been developed with sort of Italianate type features in terms of the balustrades, the central pond, and the photo on the bottom left is just looking up towards that platform. This used to be just a grassy slope across here, and in fact where the platform or the plaza sits used to be the original site of the manager's house for the Acclimatisation Society way back prior to 1863. On the bottom right is the entranceway. This was a gift to the city of Dunedin to celebrate Dunedin's 150th back in 1998, and it features looks from the gates that we saw earlier into the garden. So both the paving on the bottom and the pillars with their metalwork on top and lattice work across are all reflected in terms of their design from the pattern of the gates, if you like. Some may be familiar with the New Zealand native fern, in Maori it's called as the fern unfolds, the koru. However, these aren't particularly designed around that feature, but these elements at the top of the pillars are the ends. If you look at the gates, you can sort of see all that design in the gates, and this is where the artist took his inspiration for this work. And time's moved on, so I'll just leave you with this photograph. This is a lovely aerial photograph showing the garden. It's a little bit older now. There's some changes around the place, but certainly in the central area here, this is the Botanic Garden. The lower garden area we talked about before is down here, and of course we can sort of see the features. We've got the tea kiosk with a round roof. In between times, there's been an information centre added where the fernery was. And of course, we've got the beautiful winter garden structure, very much simpler than what it was with all the additional glass houses were added. The rock garden, the band stand is in here, and the area of the upper garden in here. Down here, we've got the Northern Cemetery. Again, it's an interesting area. It's one of Dunedin's oldest cemeteries. It's been closed for some years now, but there's a great collection of roses in there, and of course if I use the word collection, but the headstones and ornate ironwork around some of those grave sites is absolutely amazing, and certainly well worth a visit in its own right as well. And over here, I think you can see it, there's a quarry, large quarry, which has provided most of the stonework for the development around Dunedin. What else we got here? Very much enclosed, the Botanic Garden. We've got roads all around the garden, so it has nowhere else to go if there's any need for future development. But certainly over the years, rather than try and look outwards, we've actually looked within to see what we can do with the site that we do have. The Mediterranean garden that we saw before with the plaza is situated in this site here. See that grass slope there, and that looks across the lower garden. Yeah, certainly I've been there since 1980, and as you imagine, there's been quite a considerable change over that period of time as well. But yeah, I think it's a good place to end the presentation. And certainly if there's any questions, please feel free.
Thank you very much, Alan. That was brilliant. I'm just going to invite Jess. Did you want to sort of convene this section with the questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Carry on. Okay. Just to start things off, we did have a question actually from Cynthia. Cynthia, are you there? Do you want to just ask Alan your question? So Cynthia asked about the funerary. It might have been because it came up as a funny spelling on the transcript. But did you mention the word funerary, Alan?
Fernery it should be, but if it's spelt differently, F-E-R-N-E-R-Y, that would be wrong.
Explain what that means. Thank you.
The fernery. It's just a building house to grow particularly native ferns and tree ferns. Many of the ferns here in New Zealand are, I guess, tender to cold temperatures and frosts, etc. Plus, it's also just an ideal opportunity to have a facility where you can grow a whole range of plants in the one area that people can visit. And I guess it's also one of those things that people think are good to have as well. A sign of the times.
Yeah, so it's fernery. Yeah, just so we're all
fernery, yes.
Yeah.
Fernery, yeah.
Thank you.
We have another one in the chat from Nicholas, and he asks, how are Maori traditions for using plants for medicine and other purposes included in the garden? It would be good to know there has been more to inclusion of First Nations than as prisoners of war.
I'm not sure, Jess, if everybody heard you clearly. Sorry, shall I just repeat it?
Yeah.
All the Maori traditions for using plants for medicine and other purposes included in the garden. It would be good to know if there'd been more to the inclusion of First Nations than prisoners of war.
Oh, very good question. I have to say it is minimalistic in terms of our engagement with our local iwi or tribes. We have two local groups in our area, Otakau and Pokataraki. We do engage with them from time to time. We do have a trail called the Treasured Plants Trail, or Tonga, which means treasure in Maori, Taonga, and it identifies a number of plants around the garden that are used or were utilised by Maori of the day and also today in modern terms as well, whether it be medicine, food, weaving in terms of clothing, fabric type materials. So there is that, but certainly there's more to be done there. We're currently going through a strategic planning process, but part of that is consultation with our local iwi, and they have expressed an interest in being involved and discussing how they can, I guess, influence in terms of their tradition and traditional uses of plants. Have some of those ideas reflected in the modern botanic garden as it moves forward. And we're only too happy to do that. There's other elements that we don't necessarily haven't been involved in, particularly around edible plants, for instance, food crops, etc. However, there's also plans to move in that direction as well. As to the going back in time to the 1869 to about 1883 or 4 or thereabouts, when the Maori prisoners were held in Dunedin, there's certainly been a considerable amount of sort of repatriation, if you like, of the effects of that and acknowledgement of that. And yeah, there's certainly still some healing to be done around that between the different cultures. But I think there's been goodwill on both sides and how that's been achieved as well.
Could I ask a follow-up?
Certainly.
Just thank you very much for both the presentation and for your comments just now. Is there a sort of model example in New Zealand of I don't know, maybe in sort of the North Island of integration of Māori culture into a botanic garden, or do the botanic gardens reflect a more the historic British approach to gardening that the Māori have sort of rather steered clear of?
Yeah, definitely the Victorian model in terms of botanic gardens. Yeah, absolutely, that's strong and well. There are no gardens that I'm aware of that are sort of designed or purposefully constructed around the, I guess, Maori culture. Many of them are incorporating different elements of that, but any specific areas, to my knowledge at this stage, I don't think there are. I mentioned Atari Plant Museum, or Atari Botanic Garden as it is now called, growing only New Zealand's native plants. But again, that is just how that has been steered towards Maori culture, and over the period, well, the history over the years, I don't know, I don't think so, but there have been different celebratory gardens established that have recognised important plants to Maori. In Gisborne area, I think, as part of the celebrations of Captain James Cook and his trips to New Zealand in 1776, of establishing a a New Zealand garden. They have been made. That's probably the most relevant to your question that I'm aware of.
Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you, Nicholas. So Peregrine has a couple of questions. Are you there, Peregrine? Do you want to ask your questions directly?
Sure. Yeah, interesting talk. Thank you very much. I was just wondering, because I couldn't quite decipher from the graphs of the winter garden greenhouse whether that's a cast iron or a timber structure.
Yeah, timber. Totally timber, and of course that does have its issues around the longevity and maintenance as well.
Sure.
Yeah, in effect, because of the humidity in some of those areas, some have described it as sort of a compost heap in waiting. It's because the durability of timber just can't handle those conditions.
Sure.
High temperatures and that wet, humid environment.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the follow-up, slightly tangential question to that is, I think you mentioned dry rot affecting timber. And is that Serpula lacrymans, which we believe originated in the Himalayas and made its way to the UK? Is that, did you know if it is what we would call dry rot?
I can't answer that, to be quite honest. In terms of what,
it did have a sort of brownish fruiting body, and don't worry, it was only
no. Look, none I've observed. Of course, there'd be so many different
sure.
Well, I suppose species of fungi and such like that are involved in those processes. And I'm sure New Zealand has the whole raft of its own that were here well before European and Maori arrived.
I bet you do. Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much.
Yeah. But it is interesting if you go back to that winter garden before. There's the three distinct areas of the winter garden as it exists now, and we can look here. That area on the I'm pointing to now. That's what we call as a subtropical house. So the environment there is reasonably warm and humid. The central house again is higher temperatures and high humidity. But this house, the west wing, as we refer to it, this is where we grow our cactus and succulents. So in there, of course, we've got no humidity and the temperature is a little bit lower, and hence that has always been in much better condition than any of the rest of the structure because of those features and elements.
Great, thank you. I think we're coming towards closing for this evening, but Nicholas has just said it would be great to see a map of all the botanical gardens in New Zealand. And I don't know if you have such a map. Not
at this stage, no. But yeah, most of them they're all around the main centres of New Zealand. Of the gardens I've described, I guess Dunedin, Christchurch, Wellington and Auckland are the main centres of activity, if you like, for botanic gardens. And it's mainly around the fact that those centres themselves have the population and financial base to support them and develop them as well. For those smaller gardens, you just don't have that security, if you like, and that's always been the case through time, of course. But we do have a regional group here, BGANS, Botanic Gardens Australia and New Zealand, and again, the New Zealand regional gardens recognise that fact as well, and we pay a subscription, about $500 a year, for those gardens who can afford it, but others can join without paying, just in recognition of the fact that that is a burden on their financial position as well. But yeah, so we certainly recognise there's differences amongst the gardens, but you do what you can with the resources you have available to you.
Great, well, thank you very much. So I think on behalf of everybody, can we just thank you, Alan, for a brilliant talk. Sorry we were a little bit late starting.
Thank you.
And, yeah, that was fantastic. So I'll stop the recording, which will be available if you want to watch anything back. and see some of the amazing images she shared again. So yeah, thank you very much on behalf of the forum. Thanks very much, Alan. That was a brilliant talk.
Thank you.
A pleasure. It was hopefully I sort of touched on some of the elements that you folks have a professional interest in. Not too much about plants, but yeah, it's all good. It's all part of the garden.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.